Last one before lunch. We always talk about timing when we present. I won't have any slides for you today. So the good news is there's not a ton of stuff up there. The bad news is I'm going to make you work and present with me today. So we will have the opportunity to have microphones if you have a particular question. I will take questions at the end. But throughout, feel free to call out. This is going to be interactive. This is intentionally called a workshop. So I want your feedback. I want you working with me. My name is Rebecca Nerad. I have been in customer success in supply chain for 20 years, since before we used the term customer success. My first job was at then Andersen Consulting, now Accenture, and I knew just enough coding so that I could listen to what the customer was asking, translate those into business requirements, and tell them to the guy who really knew how to code well. I graduated college in the 90s at a time when everybody was moving from spreadsheets to starting to use all sorts of database applications. I didn't grow up with a background in coding or in computer science, but I fell in love with helping things make sense for customers and listening to them. I mean, this was, again, before we even had customer success. I fell into supply chain. My first companies were i2 Technologies for quite some time, JDA Software, for those of you who know Blue Yonder, long path there. I went back to the consulting side of things as well. And then about 4 years ago, came to E2 Open. At E2 Open, I have led various roles, both including leading the global customer success team as well as support. When I came to E2 Open over 4 years ago, if I asked what is customer health, the answers would have been uptime, SLAs, very support focused. It was just a glob of a team doing all sorts of responsibilities, and over the past 5 years, we've acquired about 15 companies. Very few of those had customer success. So to be able to integrate all the different teams, not just saying what are the responsibilities of my team, the customer success team, but what are the responsibilities of the other teams that we work with. And more importantly, changing the mindset shift to business outcomes. So that's not just in customer success. Of course, we use the word outcomes all the time. But even from the very beginning of when we're selling, right? When our solution consultants or pre-sales are talking to potential customers, that we aren't just moving from spreadsheets to software, that we really understand what are the outcomes that we try to achieve. And that's important for us in customer success, right? To understand, why did the customer buy this in the first place? Because that decision maker stakeholder is likely very different from the person that the CSM is engaging with after the solution has been implemented. So the more that we can actually work across the organization upstream, the more that we can understand those outcomes. So that's been a large part of what I've done at E2 Open, is integrating all these teams, segmenting for scale, by the way, great session on that. And when we were talking about what to cover today, we decided that the topic of measuring the impact, the ROI of customer success is really key. Not just because we see a recession coming, not just because as leaders, we have to justify to our organization if we need more CSMs for growth, but fundamentally, how do we describe what it is that we do and the value that we add to our organizations? How many people here are in a CSM role? You've been a CSM for, let's say, up to 2 years. You're newer to CS. Okay. How many have been around customer success a little longer, maybe team lead managing a team? And how many are the highest ranking? You are the VP, you are the chief customer officer, you're the one who talks to the other executives about decisions and funding related to customer success. Okay, great. So what we're talking about today will apply to all of you. So those of you who are talking directly to the CFO about justifying growing the team, investing in a software solution, you've had some of these conversations before. I hope still you'll walk away with just a small takeaway, a different idea, something you might not have thought to measure when you think about impact. And if you're really new in customer success, that's okay too. It still really is important to understand, how are you measured? What does your CEO think about? And how do you explain, to your family even, right? What the heck you do in customer success. So, and again, I've been at this a long time, and that's still, a fun puzzle to be able to solve. This is the only slide that's going to be here with me today. One other comment. I have a LinkedIn group just called Customer Success. You're welcome to apply there. So if you've seen this before, you might have seen it on the Customer Success group. This came about initially as an effort with my team when I said, what would be the formula for customer success? What does that look like? And they submitted different graphics, right? No words, just what are the graphics that you would use to represent? And so I've gone on to use some of these types of drawings when we're trying to represent what we do in customer success. Okay. So the cost of new customer acquisition, or how many times the cost of maintaining an existing customer? Is it twice as much? Anybody? 5 times. Really close. 7. It costs 7 times as much to acquire a new customer as to maintain the ones that you have. How do you measure what teams who you should have in place? Here's the great news. Yesterday and earlier this morning, you've been given this answer. So I'm going to quiz you now on some of the things that you learned yesterday and that you've read before on customer success on how do we actually measure the impact of our teams. Anyone have a formula or something they learned, maybe that Ashvin shared yesterday so he doesn't get to answer? Anyone have any ideas on how you might measure the impact of customer success in your organization?
Customer experience.
How do you measure customer experience?
Through engagement.
What's engagement?
Product usage.
Okay.
Product usage and trust that the customer will give you.
Okay, let's talk about this one for a moment. Product usage, right? How much do you understand what your customers are using? Usage, adoption, engagement, right? This is core to what we do in customer success. How much do we understand about our customers' usage of the solution, right? Are they engaged? How sticky is it? How many of you have measurements at your company right now that are based on usage, adoption? How much do you actually measure and understand your customers' usage, engagement? Do you measure it? Who does? Okay, great. And is that related to the contract? Is it because, as you said, we have 100 customers who, they have rights to 100. We know that 100 are using it. What's it based on? Call it out. You don't have to have a microphone. Usage adoption. How do you measure it? Logins. Okay. So are the number of people logging in per month? Okay. How's that work for you? Is it leading? Does it show you what to expect going forward? Okay. This one's great. We can pivot to this. Outcomes, right? This is the core of what we want to be able to measure, obviously, is are our customers achieving the outcomes they intended when they purchased the solutions in the first place? How many people here are actually measuring the business outcomes that your customers achieve, their business outcomes, right? Not your usage adoption, not based on their contract, on what they are achieving. Do you have measurements for that? Okay, not bad actually. Maybe that's 20%. This can be a real challenge depending on the complexity of your solutions. Please, I implore you, try to understand that more and more. Try to understand in the customer's language what outcomes they're achieving, right? And not just what, again, usage metrics that matter to you, but really understanding those outcomes. That's the why that matters. That's when they become a champion and understand and can talk more about your solution. But that can be really hard to measure. You may have one customer using the same, customer in the same industry, using the same solution, and they measure something different entirely than what another does. So you really need to do a lot of active listening and working with those customers to understand, right? Okay. So what about the cost side of things? When we think about, again, sorry, Ashvin, nobody remembers your customer retention cost. Right, what he shared yesterday was showing the CSM cost over ARR. That matters, especially at higher levels, that you're evaluating how many people are covering what responsibilities. And I love the segmentation example earlier that says, here's realistically how we can address as we scale. That's one of the things that we've done at my company as we went through these numerous acquisitions. Initially, we had a very high-touch model, because we have very complex supply chain solutions. So CSMs cover maybe 12 accounts per CSM. But when we acquired these companies that have a lot smaller, long tail, small, medium business, we now have an entirely separate segment that covers about 40 accounts per person. What does that mean? What activities do they do? How do we track that? And again, so that segmentation is obviously a piece of that. Okay, what about the revenue side? What's the most common KPI that is used to measure CSMs? Net revenue retention. Okay, so how many people at your companies right now is customer success responsible for the renewals, for the revenue at your company? Okay, maybe a third. This is a hotly debated topic in customer success. At an event like this, you might see, different people debating the pros and cons to who should own the revenue. The answer is it depends, sorry. There's a lot of research on the why there. Some of it's the complexity of how long sales is selling into the account, right? Who has what relationships. My recommendation here is it really comes down to a lot of clarity around roles and responsibilities. Again, I wanted to answer some of the questions that came up yesterday. So who owns the revenue? It doesn't matter if there's someone in sales or someone responsible for the commercial aspect of the renewal other than the CSM, that CSM still needs to be invested and care about the retention of that customer. And it's still a fair measurement, right? Because what else can you use to say, is this customer interested? Do they understand the value? Or are they coming back, and staying with us as a company? So even when you have someone else responsible for the commercial part, it still is a really key factor on how we judge and rate CSMs. Okay, what else? There were some, just in the presentation before me, there were some examples of how you know what CSMs are contributing. Upsells, great. Upsells, cross-sells, right? There are customer success qualified leads. Do you measure CSQLs? Anybody measure those right now? Okay, great. So this one is really key when we pivot from customer success just being protecting the revenue and generating more revenue. That's a great answer. And we can track it. It's really not that complicated, and it doesn't need to get in the way of how the sales team is compensated. Those are two entirely different things. Who here has customer success with a quota around cross-sell, upsell? Okay. You see that a lot more rarely. And I think there's a lot of nuance to whether or not, like, where that fits in an organization. I think the challenge there really comes to how much responsibility do CSMs have for a lot of the product support related issues? And when you have to look very closely at that role and function as relates to others when you look at the idea of having a quota expectation around cross-sell, upsell. What I've chosen to do is have a spiff. So I don't have a quota as relates to that, but I do reward that activity for services or SaaS revenue over a certain threshold. Then the CSMs get a benefit as part of that. Okay. Any other ideas how to measure the impact or the value of customer success? Yes. That was going to be said. Okay. Referrals, absolutely. So here's one where I want to challenge you all again. If you have a takeaway or something to think about, who's responsible for a referral? Lots of times at your company, you may have that's a sales function. That's pre-sales, right? When you say what customers might be able to do what referrals, but sometimes the CSMs actually have a better feel than other parts of the organization. Do your companies have an official referral process? Do CSMs have any involvement in it? Okay, great. So we have actually developed, I've worked with companies who have very robust customer referral processes, and some where it's horrible, where you just have the same two customers who you go ask all the time to talk to the same prospective customers. I think CSMs can be a really key part in the advocacy piece, as Miranda was talking about yesterday. And programmatically, this is a way that we can show the value. So at E2Open, what I did was had the CSMs become responsible for a program called Path to Promoter. So we're identifying which customers are, either red, there's something going on there, which they aren't going to be a referral right now, and that, of course, we associate with a get well plan. But then there are a lot of customers who kind of sit in the middle, not really sure if they would be a referral or not. Maybe they haven't engaged as much, or we have our executive business reviews, but I'm not sure. And then you have those obvious promoters who talk, or who are willing to talk all the time, but maybe you overuse those same folks. So we created a program where, to investigate, the CSMs across their assigned accounts are saying which of these customers would be willing to be a reference, and what does that mean? Instead of just taking a phone call, if they're willing to create reusable content, willing to participate in a webinar or a case study, obviously, that's a huge give back to marketing, and that's something that that as a CSM, you have a better view on that customer satisfaction. You're the best person to ask that. Sometimes ask it in response. If they send an email, right, they say, oh, thank you so much for helping me through this, or we've just realized this value, or thanks, that QBR was really meaningful because I went on and was able to share with my leadership the value that we're adding. At that time, ask it. Right, say, would you be willing to? And when you look at doing a case study or webinar or whatever that looks like, you're telling the customer's story. Of course, you're showcasing how your solution is giving them value, but make sure it's about making that person look like a hero in their organization and the value and the outcomes that that organization achieved. And this is something that you can get your hands on as a CS team or as a leader on really shifting what you're able to give back to your company, which fuels the sales engine, not just because you have relationships with those customers, right? So advocacy is a huge piece. Any other measurements? What about NPS or CSAT? I think this one's really tough. It's obviously an indicator, right, about customer satisfaction if they're willing to be a promoter. I think it's a really difficult thing to measure CSMs on. One of the challenges when we measure customer success is that so much is not under our direct purview. Right? And so if they're frustrated with the product or it wasn't implemented exactly to the way that they expected, or and then whatever all these things are, somebody sold something that didn't quite function in the way that you expect. Somebody implemented that maybe the scope wasn't exactly what, the customer expected. Whatever that is, you're responsible for all of that. And sometimes the best CSMs are assigned to the most problematic, challenging customers. That's the nature of it, right? Like you need to put your best people handling some of those frustrated customers. Is it fair to judge those CSMs then if those customers have a lower NPS? One answer to this is to look at the improvement of over NPS, right? If your company really values the NPS metrics, then could you at least understand what it was when a CSM was assigned and then what it is the next time that you do that, that you do the NPS or CSAT or whatever. So, yes?
Another thing I like to do is add in, so the Net Promoter question, and then add in a question rating the satisfaction with your CSM, which can allow them to differentiate between how likely do you recommend the company, but how much do you like working with the CSM?
This is huge. The idea of adding in the question on the survey, how satisfied are you with your CSM? Because it gives them the opportunity to distinguish between, again, and the best of those surveys, first of all, can't be too enormous either, but really should have some separation between product, services, and then what are those services, right? Depending on what that looks like at your company. If you can easily distinguish between onboarding, implementation, support, customer success, right? To that extent, think about those as pieces of the question. And the most important thing that Ashvin said, in my opinion, as regards those surveys is the follow-up. So that's outside of this measurement topic, but please don't go just asking your customers questions and then fail to engage with them to really understand how to improve.
One of the things I've always seen used is, or also seen used is using like customer complexity or maturity or something as a cross-reference to NPS, because then you can kind of tune for, like you were saying, the customer, putting your best CSMs on some of the trickiest customers, but using a factor to identify what is their impact compared to how tough that customer is to work with, or their sentiment or not.
How do you define complexity?
Depends on the service, right? The complexity could be based on number of users, or how many users are using the tool, or number of iterations. And cross-reference it kind of with where your product strengths and weaknesses are.
I think that's key, and I think measuring some of that across various solutions can be really challenging, but to the extent that you can understand what footprint, what solutions that customer has, where the challenges are, and then where there's improvement.
I actually have another question, but to that for gentleman's point, a customer effort score can also, like, how hard is it for us to do business with you? Can be a nice way to do that. And then another question that I had for you, if you go back a second, is even when you create really great referral programs, how can we quantify the ROI? Have you seen or used any study that can actually say that because this person joined a webinar, because they were able to do an RFP, because they were able to go to this conference with us, how do we, because just saying we generate these referrals still doesn't get them to think about the ROI on those referrals. So how do we get them to an ROI on the referrals?
That's a great question. To me, that ties in really closely to marketing, who really can be one of the best friends of customer success. So I think it depends on how detailed your company evaluates those marketing campaigns. And that is what we do, right? So we would actually track for a particular webinar or event or something that we hosted, who attended, and to what was that content in the first place. That tracks all the way through our system. There are various marketing solutions that do exactly that. The catch is actually mapping that back to the fact that it was the CSM's contribution in the first place that created that marketing material, right? So I think that's the gap I see more in between, other than just tracking the marketing. It's connecting, right, those the marketing indicators back to the effect of some of those specific campaigns or customer-related things that were generated from customer success, right? So another thing, you mentioned the idea of difficult to work with, and I think that that's something I'm probably one of the few who's old school enough to have worked with John Goodman, who's been around forever in the customer experience space. One of the metrics that he uses is easy to do business with. Are we easy to do business? Are your companies easy to do business with? Right? If you look across, that's great. Congratulations to the few of you who raised your hands. This is one that it's, again, hard to measure, but to the extent that you're willing to really understand where are the customer's major pain points, what would it improve if we could remove those few largest pain points for the customer? And this is an interesting sort of survey to do, because you need to be willing to hear all the bad feedback. The design of this type of survey is really to work with and say, all these areas, have you found that we're difficult to deal with in this and that area? What about these solutions? What about, and the feedback that you get from this is really critical, especially when you measure the possible impact and loss of some customers and some of the revenue as relates to that. So I think that can be really, like the idea of, easy to do business with, even if it's something like your procurement, right? Something that's so far outside of what you're doing in customer success, but it impacts the customer experience. How much do we actually understand or get feedback on those things? What else?
I think communication, like it's another way to measure
Communication. How do you measure communication?
as CS leader, if we're able to go back to my notes, my communication and audit them, are those clear? Are the meeting agendas sent to the customer clear? Are those being met? And CS leader, are you able to make the whole accounting pattern and say if this customer is healthy or not? The communication with internal product teams, marketing, engineering as well.
This is a great point. As far as a measurement of customer success, for me, I think some of those elements are table stakes, right? When we look at the elevation of how we're starting out customer success at your company, some of those things, are you engaging? Are CSMs having monthly operational reviews? Are they having the follow-up emails? Are they documenting it in your CRM, right? Some of those touch points are very important. At the same time, once you have the basic structure around those in place, you want to move to the next level on how you're encouraging that, right? So some of those things is part of doing the job, right? More than how you would give them a KPI associated to a bonus. And I think there's a really fine line there, right? Because our KPIs that we give our teams in customer success, of course, the best KPIs are smart and measurable. How much of a CSM's day job actually relates to those KPIs that are measurable? That's the real challenge, right? That we do want to track activity measurement, but really, how does that relate to the performance? So that can be really tricky, but great. I'm looking at my list here. We've covered a lot of these. I think one question that came up yesterday, the idea of where does customer success report into your organization? I'm going to take the opportunity to ask. So there are numerous schools of thought on where customer success should land, maybe ideally into a chief customer officer who reports to the CEO, right? But most of the time it falls either on the revenue generating sales side of the organization or on the operations side. That's where customer success typically falls. So how many of you, customer success falls into the revenue generating side of the organization? You're aligned with sales. Yeah, and how many of operations? That's the closest to half and half I've seen in this room for all of your responses. In my, at E2Open, I've been here 4 years, and I reported right into the operations side and had support and customer success. Clearly bifurcated the roles and the roles and responsibilities of these two teams. Great. Left support over here, moved over here on the revenue side, reporting to the CRO. CSMs aligned according to the sales organization, and with industry business units, just like sales. There's so many pros and cons to where we should align there, but we really need to pay attention on our measurements, right? Back to measuring and understanding the value. How does it map up through your organization? Right? How are the others in your organization measured as well? And how can our teams complement and support those measurements? I think we often fall into the place of understanding our own KPIs, but not actually understanding. Now, sales is kind of easy, but still understanding the different, how they may be compensated as it relates to renewals versus new opportunities. Some of those things we need to have an awareness on and how to best support and how to measure ourselves. Any other ideas around how to measure the impact of customer success? And this is my session. There's time for questions after this timing? Okay, great. Okay, so I think another thing, sometimes you'll say not just NPS, but red, yellow, green. That one I have a real challenge with too, because if you measure somebody on red, yellow, green, then they're more likely to lie about the health of the account so that they get better marks. And even when you're counting improvement on that, right, sometimes a customer will become more frustrated, and that you need to, the truth behind the actual customer health matters more than trying to measure that. So I think we really need to be cautious on how we measure. To me, the idea of proactivity, of awareness around customer health is where it really matters, because the CSMs are that canary in the coal mine. And so we know what's going on with the customer. Are we predicting? Are you involved in predicting future churn? Forecasting potential risk? Yeah. That's where it's really important for CSMs to understand where are the signals, usage, adoption. What is your company currently doing to track that, to share that information with others, to build a plan around it? If the CSM is having a difficult time engaging with their stakeholder doesn't really want to do an executive business review, right? Or because maybe that person left the company, maybe, and so if they fall into, well, I'll just send them the deck. You really need to have a plan around how to engage and how to predict and prevent, right? Because those quiet customers are the ones that are even more difficult to win back than the noisy ones. Okay, any other measurements? I think the real crux when we get to value realization, right? What value our customers have achieved. That's that's the gold mine, but it can be really hard to measure. So any other input before we move to the QA portion?
I think it's been touched on before, but the CSM's contribution to projects and tasks, which are good for the business and good for the professional services. Enumerate a list of the things that need to be done, especially kind of separate customer success operations.
CSM's contributions to everything outside of just the specific thing that they're measured on. That's awesome. I love this one, and I've seen it represented before as reducing costs elsewhere. Right? So when could a CSM maybe identify if we had a better way of showing the data in the product that would then increase the customer's understanding around the value, right? And maybe the CSM comes about it the first time because it's taking them too much time to really dig in and find this. So it starts with how can we automate? How can we have better operational data? How can the data, how can we create more scorecards or things that are automatically easier for the CSMs, again, so they're doing more value-add activities? But a lot of that comes from the CSMs asking why, And one of the things that I coach or ask the most to my CSMs is this the right use of your time? Because they can fall into a pattern of doing something because maybe the CSM before them did it, maybe the customer asked them to do it, maybe somebody else at the company did, right? Because it's not sales' responsibility, no, and it's not professional services responsibility because that's billable, so it's going to fall to the CSM, right? And as CSMs, we're the ones with empathy. We're the ones who are excited for our customers to get value. And some of those roles and responsibilities aren't as clearly defined, so we have the tendency to say, yeah, I can do that. Do you have clear roles and responsibilities for get well plans at your company? That can be really tough too, on who owns what pieces. And if a CSM in this example, right, is able to fill a role for maybe a get well plan that would have been a billable professional services resource time, can you represent that? How much are you actually tracking the hours that CSMs are spending on billable activity that are filling in when pre-sales or a solution consultant can't do a demo? Is that part of your responsibility? How much do you understand those? That's a great point. Really difficult to measure. But at the very least, if you are at least showcasing those examples and making sure that that leadership understands, then that also goes a long way, even if it's not, a measurement. Yes?
Yeah, to add to that, I've tried to measure it by having every CSM, as part of their OKR, have a continuous improvement. And so they're giving back in all the different ways you mentioned. And typically their bonus is also partially based on that. So then when you are advocating to leaders, you can show these are all the continuous improvement initiatives we've done. And, this is how much money we've saved, and this is the bonus we're paying out based on it. So that's been helpful.
Bonuses as relates to continuous improvement and to an earlier discussion from today, growth path as well. To me, that's really key when a CSM comes and says, at E2Open, there's CSM, senior CSM, director. And I don't have it well documented to actually have all the descriptors in the same way. But one of my main responses there is, what are you doing to improve the lives of customers, other CSMs, other parts of the organization? And it's tough when some of those responsibilities don't fall under our purview, but if we see a real gap in support, it really is the responsibility of that CSM to identify where there could be improvement. I've had CSMs who maybe they even create or run or ask questions around a support report so that they can understand it, so they can see what value would add if they created it. That doesn't mean that should be the CSM's responsibility to run, if it's related to something like case backlog or something very support related. Hand that to that support manager, right? Give it to the other team whose responsibility it should be, but those types of improvements that are coming out of the CSM understanding the customer's pain, right, that creates improvement for the rest of the organization. And to me, that's one of the fundamental cores on why someone should be promoted, why they should be given opportunities to do other things in the organization, because they are seeing outside of just what their customer needs, and then it helps the lives of others within the company. Excellent. Okay, we're going to pivot to any more official questions, even though this format has obviously been generally open and hopefully, again, at least disorganized though it may be, maybe give you a little bit of nuggets of something to think about and challenging yourself how to measure. Starting, here comes the mic.
First of all, great presentation. I really enjoyed that. And I just wanted to ask for your input. We have a fairly small CSM team. It happens that we're all probably in the back half of our career, so none of us are particularly interested in advancement. We're doing this because we're good at it and we really like it, right? We also like to be compensated as well. So my question to you is, what we've struggled with, the team of us realizes we can assist on upselling big time. Right now, the only quota we have, and you touched on this, but the only quota we have is for renewals, which is that's significant in and of itself. But it happens that we all come from very strong sales backgrounds in our career, related, and we know we're like itching to do something. Sales would like to have us do something, but there's this tension between nobody wants the quota. And we're trying to figure out a model of like, well, what would that look like? Because we're certainly all willing to help and maybe get comped in some way, but we would like to get comped in some way for it, but not hold a quota. And I just wondered, you have any thoughts on that at all? Like,
I have a ton of thoughts on this one. And as I said, I have created the model at this, my past 2 companies was one of a spiff. So basically saying there's not a quota expectation for cross-sell, upsell, right? You're responsible for net revenue retention, for preventing churn, for those things. But you play a key role because you're the trusted advisor to the customer. You understand, you're the ears when they're saying what else they might want to better understand about the solution. And especially the more that you understand about the related solutions or functionality, what else you could cross-sell, upsell, right? CSM is in a unique position there. The challenge is oftentimes we feel empowered by saying, but I'm not sales. Like, I just want to make sure you get value out of the solution, right? So there's a balance there, but there's real power too in saying that I'm your CSM. So how can you reward the CSMs who are doing that well? We created a structure that is, if a CSM identifies an opportunity which becomes services revenue or solution, right? So if it's professional services, because let's say they want to invest in scoping out adding additional functionality, and it would be different professional services hours. Or it's another module, cross-sell, upsell, right? Or maybe it's adding more partners, distributors, resellers, users, right? So it's changing the volumes. Whatever that is that the CSM has identified, if it results in X amount of revenue, I found it's really complicated to try to reward on the smallest of scales unless you're really tied in more closely to the sales organization and their processes. Again, some of that depends on who owns the renewal. But just very, very simply, if the CSM identified an opportunity that resulted in X dollars of sales opportunity, then they get Y dollars of a spiff, of a bonus, a spot bonus for that. That's exactly what we've put in place. I've done both. I've had percentage bonus. The challenge where percentage bonuses become complicated is when it starts to overlap a little too closely to sales. And so the company goes, wait a second, we're giving them a percentage and the CSM a percentage, right? And so that is really, that can be a challenge to define. And also the roles and responsibilities, as you were saying. So you have to be very clear about at what point, right? If a CSM is just originating the opportunity and passing it off to sales, are they seeing it through more, like who plays what roles there, what's expected of the CSM to be able to get that compensation. In our case, it's actually identification, right? If they hear of a genuine opportunity that they hand over to a sales associate, which ends up closing, then the CSM's rewarded. They aren't if it doesn't close, right? It's not like a biz dev sort of they took it from phase 1 to 2, right? So you have to define very clear rules about who gets rewarded. Then in our case, it was over a certain ARR threshold, right? If you happen to work with a customer and they're interested in adding 10 more partners, then it's just a couple. We're not going to give a big spiff around that. So some of it depends on the revenue difference to your company. And for us, it made more sense to just have you get X dollars for this particular type of activity. And one other comment, we were talking about advocacy. I've given spiffs around customer advocacy as well. So if you have a CSM who has a customer who was willing to participate in a webinar or a case study, you can give a spot bonus to that CSM for that. Obviously, you need to have some rules around that, but that's a great way to kick off that type of program as well, to be able to reward that CSM for advocacy.
So based on the spiffs, or I'm finding it a little challenging to wrap my head around as well, in terms of if our CSMs, maybe in a more mature organization, are compensated by NRR, by net revenue retention, then that is sales including, right? So it's expansions and contractions. So how do you give them a spiff when their actual, like their pay structure should be based on net revenue retention if you're at that mature organization?
Right. A lot of that depends on the structure of your contracts. So excellent question. That's why it's hard to give a global answer here. That's a fair question. And sometimes it depends. You may have contracts that have universal usage of a particular, don't care how many, users are using that. There is no cross sell. Like, you just want to make sure that they renew that. So typically it's outside of the standard renewal. Sometimes for a standard renewal, your company may choose to just throw in that, the secondary thing because they want to add stickiness, and there's not additional revenue associated with that. So that's if it's during the renewal process in that case, where it's part of that negotiation. So it's part of again, this depends on if you measure gross or net revenue retention, right? But that's factored in. In our case, this is separate. Because NRR is part of their KPI, this is a separate opportunity outside of the traditional renewal cycle. And it typically is identifying maybe a different solution, something that's separate. And it may still be volumetric, right, when you're actually identifying that. That is another one too.
Basically jumbo. Is it jumbo out of the ordinary?
Yes. Okay. We have... Iman, you didn't ask me any questions.
I was going to, but I'm going to take a little bit different spin on this, right? So you're in a leadership position where you see all these metrics and you have these different programs and level of scorecarding. Have you ever used that information to go to like a chief revenue officer or a business development officer and say, look, we have to fire some of our customers because they are not the right kind? And based on the CSM's due diligence and all the information they're bringing back. I'm just curious if you have that take on it, because we're always looking at growth and more and achieve and outcomes, but what is the correction? Because some customers are not good.
This is a great question, and I think there are different company philosophies on this, right? Even just within the leadership teams themselves, right? You may have some execs who say, you will not lose that customer, they will not churn, right? And that can be tough. To me, it comes back to, not surprisingly, the data. So we actually have analyzed, do have that information on what's the operational cost to serve some of these customers, and then in that case, is it actually at least sharing that? Now, we may make a choice because there's potential growth opportunity outside of the current ARR, right? We see that it's worth it, there are reasons. But to me, that awareness of making the active choice instead of just falling in the place where you're throwing out a ton of money and resources. In particular, what I see is challenges around SLAs. More and more customers are wanting more tight SLAs, turnaround times, support of their staging environments, and times related to that, which we haven't had to do historically. And the costs associated with those, we need to be very cautious about. And customer success needs to be closely working with the sales organization as relates to some of those promises that they may make that support or operations end up needing to try to answer. Yes, Rebecca.
I have a question in regards to, gathering feedback from clients, because a lot of the times when I'm discussing stuff with my CEO, they're asking, have the clients provided feedback? What are clients saying? Are they happy? And sometimes it's like pulling teeth to get feedback from them on how is your program going? Did you enjoy your onboarding experience? In that sense. And so I wanted to know if you had any successful setups with gathering feedback from clients that would obviously, feed into measuring the service that customer success offers.
Great question. There are two primary ways to do this. One is at different phases in the customer life cycle, right? So the customer has just purchased the solution. How was your experience? Okay, fine. And sometimes this may be such a big logo win that your company wants to showcase that they chose you in the first place and make a press release over that. Great. But then once the solution has been rolled out, what was the difference between the pre-state and the post, and at some other point, right, that's when you would actually engage and say, what's the value that they've been getting? So the first time is looking at the different phases in the customer life cycle. When's the right touch point to re-engage and to understand that the value that they're getting? Some of that depends on how long it takes to implement your solution. The other is doing a more holistic NPS survey type process, right? And that could be once a year. And you can also choose how you want to engage with which stakeholders. If you have really big tiers of customers, you have one large segment of strategic customers, you may choose to reach out to 3 different stakeholders there, right? The IT and the business and the sponsor. Where if you have this long tail of a ton of different customers, you just may want to send something more general that's typically sent out through, let's say, marketing, or there's a big initiative, but then who in customer success is helping follow up with their customers, right, to remind them to answer the survey, to give the feedback. And then when they do give the survey, who within your company owns the engagement, the follow-up with those customers on the feedback. So all of these are different pieces, one being life cycle related, and one being a whole project initiative. In addition to that, you just have the basic feedback loops of, let's see, CSAT surveys when when a customer closes a case, what that might be, or your executive business reviews, which ideally you're planning in advance with your main stakeholder to get some feedback so that they're presenting, and that's an opportunity too. But that's more one-on-one than the holistic approach, as I mentioned earlier.
We've talked a couple times about effort to support a customer, firing bad customers and stuff like that. What are some of the insights that you use to determine the margin or the profit or the cost of a customer, or effort with a customer, without going to tactical things like time tracking and stuff like that is, operationally heavy and of questionable value?
Time tracking, that's one of my favorites. No, I end up being somewhat balanced on the need for some basic time tracking, if you think of it as hours spent per customer per week, right? But without having to get too detailed. We do a lot of time tracking at my company. And part of that is, especially when we have professional services resources who should be on billable projects, how much of their time is spent doing productive non-bill, right? We have a lot of categories around productive non-bill and get well plans and that type of thing. So that information is very useful. But even at a very high level, you can also go on the number of resources, right? How many CSMs are serving which customers and doing what type of activities? If you can even just bucket, right, the fact that maybe your CSM for a particular product set, right, the CSMs are unable to be strategic and advisory because product issues, support issues have dragged them into doing that type of work, and so you aren't able to do the value add that you expect. How many CSMs, how many customers are they not able to take care of? What is their time spent? What are you not able to cover? I think on a very high level, right, without getting into the details of time tracking, you can really look at what are they doing? Again, back to what's the right use of my time? And again, you don't have to get super detailed there, but how operational, how detailed, how support, how much time are they spending chasing? I hate that word, right? Or not the word, the actual having to do it. But it's those types of things. And so if you look for some of the most problematic customers, right, to be more data focused, even high level, how many people is it taking to serve that customer? How many people are on how many calls behind the scenes too, right? If it's, developers or support. And some of that information you can do on a very high level without the time tracking to understand. And you relate it to ARR. I mean, that's something that your CSMs, whether or not you even own the renewals, they really need to know when the renewal's coming up, what's the ARR, because that value to your company matters. And you need to understand as a leader about how much time it costs to serve. I don't know if I answered it, because there's... Yeah.
Well, do we have any more questions? Anyone out there? No? Well, this has been great, Rebecca. I appreciate your insights, your value to the content.